This one's kind of a weird theme, things. I guess the easy way to sum it up is material culture. But really what I want to talk about is portable artifacts, with some interludes about how these things are made. The thing you have to remember here though, well, really you should be thinking about it all the time when you're talking about archaeology, but I'm going to emphasize it again here, is preservation. There are some things that just aren't going to stick around for us to find. Wood isn't great for it, textiles are pretty hopeless. Organics more generally will only preserve when they're either submerged completely or they're really, really dry. If the moisture is more moderate or intermittent, it will actually accelerate decay. That's why you might notice that on wooden docks, the pilings will often rot the fastest right near the waterline. Being frozen, permanently frozen, can also help, but that only really happens on mountains or in the Arctic, so it doesn't really apply for my purposes. Bones will preserve better sometimes than other organics, but they really don't like acidic soils, they'll just dissolve. So you have to think there were many things like wooden buckets or clothes that people had lots of, but we don't recover them. The other side of that is we sometimes find things in ridiculous numbers. There are tons of dress fasteners from Ireland and Scotland, for example. Pins, brooches, clasps, just all over the place. There are so many of them that there's piles of archaeological writing about them. Is that an indication of some kind of obsession in the ancient past with fastening clothes? Well, no, it's not. It's just that they're small and they're made of metal. So they both preserve well and people lost them easily, so people were making lots of them. A cool thing for us archaeological nerds though is you can find the things that people used to make the things that don't preserve. So we have metal tools that let us know what kinds of carpentry people were doing. Or you might find things like spindle whorls, which look like little tops without the shaft going through the middle. They'll be made of things like stone that preserve, and they were what was used to spin wool into yarn or other things into different kinds of string. Of course, some other things do preserve. Pottery, for example, is an important type of portable artifact that we do find. It's also interesting archaeologically because you can't recycle ceramics. Once you fire clay, it changes chemically, and you can't make it soft again to make a new piece of pottery. So similar thing with the dress fasteners. If people were breaking their old ceramics, they had to use new clay to make new artifacts. It means this stuff can kind of accumulate over the years in archaeological sites. Some places like Greek archaeological sites, you can just find heaps of this stuff and it gets piled off to the side of an archaeological site. In Britain and Ireland, you don't actually find that much pottery. Before the era of tea swigging got into full swing and they got into porcelain tea sets, people in Britain and Ireland didn't really take that much time to get good at making ceramics. So the older stuff is pretty rough. The good stuff is imported. So, to be honest, I don't find it that exciting. It isn't actually archaeologically disinteresting. There's a lot you can learn from it, but people in the time I'm interested in clearly didn't care as much about developing those skills. They were much better at carving in wood and bone and stone. Their metalwork was also pretty fantastic. The Atlantic Islands have had significant deposits of precious metals for a long time, like tin. Ireland had a lot of gold. If you ever get the chance to see the treasury in the National Museum of Ireland, you'll get to see this collection of some of the really spectacular ornamental metal pieces that have been found. Especially some of the medieval religious treasures like the Cross of Cong or the Ardagh Chalice. If you see that stuff too, you'll be able to notice all the different techniques people knew that went into making these really spectacular things. There was jewelry, glassmaking, filigree, which was really delicate metalwork that made designs with wire or other fine pieces. Last time I mentioned how knotwork really isn't the main kind of quote-unquote Celtic art out there. The original stuff that got called Celtic, the older stuff, was called Latin artwork. Latin artwork is associated with some of those Central Europeans I mentioned before. It's very swirly. There's a lot of scrolls and trumpet designs in it. It's also very abstracted. There aren't a lot of realistic depictions of figures in Latin art. There are some really beautiful pieces from Britain and Ireland, like the Battersea Shield, which is now in the British Museum, or the Turo Stone, which I think is in a village somewhere in County Galway in Ireland. The knotwork thing becomes more common in the medieval period, but Irish and Scottish art, which is particularly well known because of manuscript illuminations and such, it keeps a lot of the swirly and abstract elements of Latin art, if you know what you're looking for in it. A really fascinating thing about this type of art is that despite how abstract and flowing it was, this stuff was very mathematically executed, and it has these very complex types of symmetry and proportion. This wasn't easy to do, and a really cool thing is we find sometimes pieces where artisans were practicing, like bones where someone has kind of haphazardly covered it in all these different carpets of designs that they're going to later do on something else. Another interesting thing to think about is that art has served different purposes in different societies. Nowadays we think of art as more subversive and for challenging established ideas, but in the medieval period, art was much more conservative, and people commissioned it specifically to perpetuate power structures and established values. I know less about this, and an art critic I am not, but there are some people who've done some really cool work on this kind of stuff, like Boyd Lang, who knows more about art than I do, and I still think it's important to think about when we're trying to understand the ways that people thought in the past, and just the way that the past worked. That's all I have for this week, though. It's kind of a short one, because it's kind of a weirdly configured topic I wanted to talk about, but I'll see you soon with something else.